The nail gun coughed twice, then went quiet. Evan froze with his knee on a warped pallet, one hand bracing the board, the other still wrapped around the tool like it could explain itself. His phone buzzed hard against the dusty plywood beside him, rattling toward the edge of the makeshift floor. A cold coffee in a paper cup sat near his boot, the lid half popped from where he'd knocked it earlier. Down on the sidewalk, someone laughed, sharp and loud enough to cut through the morning traffic. "Yo!" a guy called from across the street. "Hey, Pallet Palace. You building a clubhouse, or what?" Another laugh followed, then a car horn. Evan's throat tightened. He didn't look down right away, like if he stayed focused on the wood grain, the world would stop noticing him. His phone buzzed again. The screen flashed the name of the one person he couldn't afford to ignore. Evan swallowed, hit answer, and tried to keep his voice steady. "Yeah. You got my message," the landlord said. "No hello. Just that flat, business voice people used when they'd already decided you were a problem." "I'm working on it," Evan said, staring at the pallet slats. The boards weren't straight. Nothing in his life felt straight lately. "You've been working on it for 3 months." Evan squeezed his eyes shut. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he could hear the laugh again. He could see the faces from the neighborhood app. Screenshots of his yard, his half-built frame, the stacks of pallets like a junkyard. The comments that came with it. He looked out across the street at the guy still watching, arms crossed like he was waiting for the show to continue. Evan forced his eyes away. "I'll have it," he said, even though he wasn't sure what it meant anymore. The landlord exhaled like Evan was wasting his oxygen. "End of week. Or you're out." The call ended. Evan held the phone against his ear a second longer, listening to nothing. Then he lowered it and stared at the missed call notification he knew would come next. His sister, asking if he'd eaten, asking if he'd called the county office like she'd told him. His eyes burned, and he hated that, because it made him feel weak, like the boards beneath him. He wiped his face with the back of his glove, leaving a smear of sawdust across his cheek. The nail gun felt heavier than it should. He stood up slowly, careful not to shift the pallet frame too much. It creaked under him, complaining. He'd learned to read the sound of wood the way some people read moods. One wrong move and the whole thing could twist. And if it twisted, he wasn't sure he could fix it. He stepped down from the frame and walked to the stack of pallets by the fence. The smell of old shipping would hit him, dried pine, oil stains, sun-baked dust. They were ugly, yes. They were mismatched, cracked, stamped with faded logos from warehouses in Indiana and Texas and somewhere in New Jersey. But they were free. Free was the only price Evan could keep up with. He'd never planned to be the guy building a house out of abandoned pallets. If you asked him a year ago, he would have laughed too. He'd been a shift supervisor at a distribution center outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of job that didn't sound impressive but paid enough to keep the lights on. He'd had a small rental, a used Civic, and a routine that made life feel manageable. Then the center automated part of the line. They offered him fewer hours, then a buyout, then nothing. He'd told himself it would be temporary. He'd applied everywhere. Grocery stores, hardware stores, call centers. He'd gone to interviews with a tie that didn't fit right anymore because he'd lost weight without trying. He'd smiled too much. He'd promised he was flexible. Meanwhile, his rent didn't care about his flexibility. Evan's sister, Dana, had offered her couch. Dana had 2 kids and a husband who tried to be polite about it, but polite had limits. Evan understood that. So he moved into the only place he could, his mother's old property on the edge of town, a narrow lot with a sagging garage and weeds that refused to die. Their mom had passed 2 years earlier. The house had been sold to cover medical bills. The lot remained because nobody wanted it. Evan had kept it because he couldn't stand the idea of losing the last piece of her. He told himself he'd clean it up and sell it someday. Instead, he was living out of the garage, sleeping on a foam pad between boxes of holiday decorations and tools that didn't belong to him but felt like they did because they'd been his dad's once. He'd strung up a cheap curtain for privacy. He'd installed a used window AC unit he found online and prayed the electric bill wouldn't spike. At night, he scrolled listings for apartments he couldn't afford and watched videos of people building tiny homes out of salvaged materials. It was supposed to be inspiration. Most nights it just made him feel like he was watching a different species. People who had time, money, confidence, a partner behind the camera saying, "Babe, that looks amazing." Evan didn't have a babe. He didn't even have a best friend he felt comfortable calling anymore. Losing his job had changed the way conversations went. People didn't mean to, but they asked questions that landed like pressure. Any leads? Have you tried that place? Maybe you should move. As if moving was a simple thing. As if you could pack up shame in a box and tape it shut. So he kept to himself. He started going to the industrial area near the freeway where trucks dropped off loads. There were always pallets stacked by dumpsters, some broken, some perfectly good, all considered trash. He'd load them into his Civic until the suspension begged for mercy. He'd bring them back to the lot and stack them neatly, like being neat could make it less embarrassing. The first time a neighbor saw him, she'd stared like he was stealing. Evan had explained too fast, voice shaky, hands out like he was surrendering. "They said I could take them. They're throwing them out." She'd nodded slowly, like she didn't know what to do with that information. By week 2, the nicknames started. Pallet Man, Pallet Palace. HGTV called yet. The jokes were never said with outright cruelty. That almost made it worse. Because then Evan couldn't even be angry. He just felt small. Like he'd shrunk inside his own skin, and nobody had noticed except to point it out. Still, he kept building. Not because he thought it would impress anyone. Not because he believed it would go viral in a good way. He kept building because it gave him something he could control. If a board didn't fit, he could cut it. If a wall leaned, he could brace it. The wood didn't ask him why he wasn't good enough. The wood didn't send him rejection emails. That morning, after the landlord call, his hands shook as he sorted through pallets. He found one with slats wide enough for the exterior cladding he'd planned. Another with tighter boards he could use for interior framing. He'd watched enough tutorials to know what not to do, and enough real life to know that knowing wasn't the same as succeeding. His phone buzzed again. This time, Dana's name lit up the screen. He stared at it, thumb hovering. He didn't want the pity in her voice. He didn't want the gentle lecture. He didn't want her to hear the sawdust in his breathing and know he was crying without actually crying. He let it ring out. Then he picked up the nail gun again. The weight of it settled into his palm. It was familiar now, like a second chance you didn't fully trust but kept holding anyway. Across the street, the guy who'd yelled earlier shook his head and walked off, laughing to himself. Evan watched him go, then looked back at the frame, his rough, stubborn outline of a home. He took a breath. And he pulled the trigger. The nail gun coughed back to life, and the sound filled the empty space where Evan's confidence used to be. Steady, imperfect, but real. At the edge of his lot, the wind lifted a loose tarp and snapped it like a flag, like the world was daring him to stop. Evan didn't stop. He couldn't. Not if he wanted a place to stand that didn't feel borrowed. Not if he wanted to prove something, maybe not to them but to himself, that he could still build a life out of what everyone else threw away. By the time the sun slid behind the low strip mall at the end of the road, Evan's shoulders felt like stone. He shut off the nail gun and stood there listening to the quiet hum that followed, the kind that made your ears ring after a long shift. His back ached in a deep, dull way. He welcomed it. Pain meant he'd done something measurable today. He climbed down from the frame and sat on an overturned bucket. His phone showed 3 missed calls now. 2 from Dana. 1 from a number he didn't recognize. Probably spam. Or worse, another reminder of something he couldn't fix yet. He took a sip of the coffee he'd forgotten about earlier. It was warm now, bitter. He drank it anyway. A car slowed on the street. Evan's shoulders tensed without him meaning to. He was used to that now, the pause, the stare, the judgment. But instead of laughter, he heard a door shut. Footsteps. Careful ones. Hey, a voice said. Female. Older. Not mocking. Evan looked up. A woman stood near the edge of his lot, hands tucked into the pockets of a faded denim jacket. She had gray hair pulled back in a low ponytail and wore sneakers that looked like they'd seen a lot of miles. Sorry, she said quickly. I didn't mean to startle you. I live 2 houses down. I'm Ruth. Evan wiped his hands on his jeans and stood. It's fine. I'm Evan. Ruth nodded toward the structure behind him. The pallet walls were still uneven, the roof frame just a suggestion. You've been busy. Trying to be, Evan said. His instinct was to explain himself, to defend the mess, the idea, his own existence. He stopped short of it, the words clogging in his throat. Ruth studied the build for a moment, not like a spectator, but like someone actually seeing it. My husband worked construction, she said. Back when his knees still liked him. Evan gave a small smile before he could stop himself. She pointed to a corner brace he'd installed that afternoon. That'll help with the sway. Smart choice. Something loosened in his chest. Yeah, I hope so. They stood there in the cooling air. A train horn sounded in the distance. Somewhere, a dog barked. Normal sounds. Life going on without commentary. I saw the stuff people posted online, Ruth said finally. She didn't soften it. Didn't pretend she hadn't. Not kind. Evan felt heat creep up his neck. Yeah, well, people talk. They do, she agreed. Most of the time it's because they're scared of ending up close to where you are. Makes them loud. He hadn't expected that. He looked at her more closely now, the lines around her eyes, the steady way she stood. You don't seem scared. Ruth shrugged. I already lost what I was afraid of losing. The words hung there. Evan didn't ask. She didn't explain. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Listen, I'm not here to fix anything. But the community center on Maple has a tool share. Not fancy. Mostly donated stuff. But they've got insulation scraps sometimes. Leftover from bigger jobs. I thought you might want to know. Evan stared at the paper like it might disappear. Why are you telling me this? Ruth met his eyes. Because everyone deserves a door that closes. His throat tightened. He nodded, once. Thank you. She smiled, small and tired and real. You're welcome. And for what it's worth, this doesn't look like a joke to me. After she left, Evan sat back down on the bucket. He unfolded the paper slowly. An address. A phone number. Handwritten. It wasn't a miracle. It didn't solve his landlord problem. It didn't erase the comments or magically straighten the walls he'd built. But it did something else, something quieter. It reminded him that not everyone was watching to laugh. That night, he called Dana back. I'm okay, he said before she could ask. I'm not great. But I'm okay. There was a pause on the line. Then relief. I'm glad you called. They talked about nothing important. Her kid's school project. A leak under her sink. Normal things. When they hung up, Evan didn't feel fixed. He felt less alone. The next morning, he went to the community center. The place smelled like dust and old paint. A volunteer showed him stacks of insulation wrapped in plastic, slightly torn but usable. Take what you can carry, the man said. Evan loaded his car carefully. On the drive back, he caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. He looked tired. Older. But his eyes didn't look as empty as they had a week ago. When he pulled into the lot, a couple of neighbors watched from their porches. No comments this time. No laughter. Just quiet curiosity. Evan unloaded the insulation piece by piece. As he worked, he felt a strange resistance inside himself. A voice that said, "Don't get hopeful. Don't read into it." This doesn't mean anything changes. He listened to the voice. He didn't silence it. He just didn't let it decide everything. By late afternoon, he'd tucked the insulation into one wall section. It wasn't pretty. It wouldn't be featured anywhere. But when he stepped inside the frame and the wind didn't cut straight through him, he noticed. He stood there for a long moment, hands on his hips, breathing in the dusty, unfinished air. Change, he realized, didn't arrive with applause. Sometimes it showed up quietly, in the form of a neighbor who didn't laugh, or a scrap of material someone else had thrown away, or a single wall that held just a bit more warmth than the day before. And sometimes, the hardest part wasn't building something new. It was believing you were allowed to. The first cold night came earlier than Evan expected. It wasn't winter yet. The weather app still said fall, still used words like mild and cool, but the wind didn't care about labels. It slid through the gaps in the pallets and pressed against Evan's ribs while he lay on the foam pad, staring at the ceiling beams above him. The insulation helped, but only in spots. The rest of the air felt thin and sharp. He pulled his hoodie tighter and checked his phone. 2:17 a.m. Sleep had been hard lately. His body was tired, but his mind kept pacing. Numbers ran through his head like a loop he couldn't break. Days until the end of the week, dollars left in his account, hours he could maybe pick up doing delivery if his car held together. He thought about the landlord's voice. Flat. Final. End of week. Evan rolled onto his side and stared at the half-built wall where the moonlight leaked in. He'd told himself this was progress. And it was. But progress didn't come with guarantees. It didn't stop fear from showing up in the dark. Around 4, he gave up on sleep and sat up. His breath puffed white for a second before fading. He laughed quietly at that, a humorless sound. He'd seen people online romanticize struggle like this. Cold nights. Hustle. Building from nothing. None of them talked about the part where your chest felt tight for no clear reason, or how every small sound made you wonder if someone was about to knock and tell you to move along. By morning, his hands were stiff. He made instant oatmeal on a camp stove and ate it standing up. When his phone buzzed, his stomach dropped before he even looked. It was the unknown number again. He answered. Evan Miller. A woman asked. Yes. This is code enforcement with the county. The words landed heavy. Too heavy for something so simple. She was polite. Almost apologetic. A complaint had been filed. The structure didn't meet zoning or safety requirements. He had 30 days to bring it into compliance or remove it. 30 days sounded generous until she added, but that doesn't override any private lease or eviction timeline you may be dealing with. After the call, Evan stood there staring at the pallet wall. He pressed his palm against it, feeling the rough wood under his skin. It felt solid. It felt real. And suddenly it felt pointless. He sat down hard on the bucket and put his head in his hands. The voice in his head grew louder. This was stupid. You're embarrassing yourself. You're wasting time. You should have taken Dana's couch. You should have tried harder. He stayed like that until his legs cramped. When he finally stood, the world felt off, like the ground had shifted a few inches to the left. He didn't work that day. For the first time since he'd started, he couldn't make himself pick up the nail gun. Instead, he drove. He didn't know where at first. He ended up at the grocery store parking lot where he used to sit during lunch breaks at the distribution center. The place looked the same. New banners, same concrete cracks. He sat in his car and watched people walk in and out with full carts. He remembered complaining once about how tired he was, how he felt stuck. He'd had no idea what stuck really felt like. His phone buzzed again. Dana. He ignored it. Then a text came through. I'm worried about you. That was it. No advice. No pressure. Just the truth. Evan leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes. He thought about calling her. He thought about Ruth's words. Everyone deserves a door that closes. Did he believe that included him? On the drive back, He passed a row of newly built townhomes. Clean lines. Matching doors. A banner out front read starting in the low 300s. He laughed out loud this time, bitter but real. When he got to the lot, the pallets looked different to him. Not hopeful. Just exposed. Like all the ways his life didn't fit neatly into forms or expectations were stacked out in the open for anyone to judge. He kicked one of the loose boards. It shifted but didn't break. The small resistance surprised him. Evan froze. He knelt and examined the joint. It held. Not perfect, but strong enough. He stood slowly and looked at the structure again. Really looked this time. The corners he'd reinforced. The insulation tucked in. The roof frame waiting. This wasn't a dream. It wasn't a fantasy. It was unfinished work. And maybe that was the problem. Not that he was failing, but that he was tired of carrying it alone. That evening, Ruth stopped by again. She didn't say much. Just handed him a pair of work gloves. "My husband's," she said. "Too big for me." Evan took them. "I might lose." She smiled. "Then they'll be used." After she left, Evan sat inside the frame and watched the sky darken through the open roof. His chest still felt tight. His problems were still there. But something had shifted. He pulled out his phone and opened a note. He started writing down what he actually needed, not what would impress anyone, not what would shut people up. Just what would make the space livable. Safe. A real door. Weather sealing. One solid window. The list was short. Manageable. For the first time in days, he picked up the nail gun again. His hands shook, but he didn't put it down. The breaking point, he realized, wasn't about giving up. It was about deciding what was worth holding onto when quitting felt easier. The rain came on a Tuesday morning, steady and unannounced. Not a storm, not dramatic. Just rain that soaked into everything if you ignored it long enough. Evan stood under the half-finished roof and watched it fall through the gaps he hadn't sealed yet. Drops hit the floor, darkening the plywood in uneven circles. A week ago, the sight would have made his chest cave in. Proof that he was behind. Proof that he wasn't ready. Now, he just reached for the tarp. He'd learned something in the last few days. Panic didn't actually fix anything. It just burned energy he didn't have. So he worked slower. More deliberate. He covered what he could, accepted what he couldn't yet, and kept moving. He'd gone back to the community center twice. The second time, the volunteer remembered his name. That mattered more than Evan expected. He picked up more insulation, a used door someone had donated after a remodel, and a small window with a cracked corner that still sealed tight. Installing the door took him an entire afternoon. He measured 3 times. Cut once. Still had to adjust. When it finally swung closed and latched, the sound echoed inside the space. Solid. Final. Evan stood there with his hand on the handle longer than necessary. That night, the temperature dropped again. He sat inside, back against the wall, knees pulled in. The door held. The wind stayed outside. It wasn't warm. But it was quieter. The landlord called the next day. Evan answered without rehearsing what he'd say. "I'm not asking for sympathy," Evan said. His voice surprised him by staying level. "I'm asking for time. 30 days. I can show you where I'm going." There was a pause. Papers shifting. A sigh. "Send me photos," the landlord said finally. "I can't promise anything." "I know," Evan said. And he meant it. He sent the photos that evening. No filters. No angles meant to impress. Just the truth of it. The rough walls. The door. The progress. Days passed. No response. Evan kept working. Neighbors still watched, but the tone had changed. One afternoon, the guy who'd yelled weeks earlier slowed down near the lot. "That door looks solid," he said, not smiling, not mocking. Just stating it. "Thanks," Evan replied. The man nodded once and kept walking. It wasn't an apology. Evan didn't need it to be. Ruth stopped by with soup one evening. She didn't frame it as charity. She just said, "Made too much." Dana came on a Sunday with her kids. They ran around the lot, asking questions, touching the wood, impressed in a way only kids could be. "You built this?" her son asked, eyes wide. Evan nodded. "Still building." "That's cool," the boy said, like it was obvious. Later, after they left, Evan sat alone inside the structure and let the quiet settle. He thought about how different this felt from the beginning. Not easier, just steadier. The email from the landlord came 2 days later. "I'll extend for 30 days. Keep me updated." Evan read it twice. Then he set the phone down and exhaled slowly. It wasn't victory. It wasn't security. It was room to breathe. By the end of the month, the house didn't look impressive from the street. The pallets were still pallets. The lines were still uneven if you looked close enough. But inside, there was a small table Evan built himself. A chair someone left by the curb that he fixed instead of replacing. A light bulb hanging from the ceiling that turned on every time. One evening, after a long day of delivery work and building, Evan sat at the table with a simple meal and listened to the quiet. No laughter outside. No commentary online. Just the hum of the world doing its thing. He realized something then. People hadn't mocked him because the pallets were ugly. They mocked him because he was visible in a way struggle usually isn't. He'd built his uncertainty out in the open, and that made people uncomfortable. But discomfort wasn't failure. Evan wasn't a success story you'd package neatly. He didn't prove everyone wrong. Some people still didn't get it. Some never would. What he had was smaller, quieter. He had a space he made with his own hands. A door that closed. A life that wasn't finished, but wasn't falling apart either. And maybe that was enough. As the light faded through the small window, Evan thought about how many people were carrying something similar. Unfinished plans, public doubt, private fear. He wondered how many were building quietly, out of whatever scraps they could find, hoping someone would understand. He turned off the light, lay down, and listened to the house settle around him. It held.